The smell of my late wife's roses hit me the moment I stepped through the back door, and for just a moment, I forgot why I had come home early. It had been 41 years since Margaret planted those roses along the fence line, pink and stubborn, just like her. She used to say that a garden tells you everything you need to know about the people who tend it, whether they're patient, whether they show up even when nothing seems to be growing. After she passed 3 years ago, I kept watering those roses every single morning. Not because I had a green thumb, because it was the only way I knew how to still be her husband. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, breathing in that familiar sweetness. And then I remembered, I was supposed to be in Portland. My name is not important. What I am, what I was, matters more to this story. I spent 32 years as a physician, internal medicine, a private practice in a mid-sized city in Ohio. I retired at 66, healthy enough, sharp enough, just tired of the paperwork and the insurance battles and the slow grinding bureaucracy that had swallowed the profession I once loved. My wife had already been diagnosed by then. I wanted to be home with her. I wanted those last months to belong to us. After she was gone, the house felt enormous. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a backyard that Margaret had turned into something worth photographing every season. My daughter had moved back into the area 2 years before her mother died. She and her husband bought a place about 20 minutes from me. That proximity felt like a blessing at the time. She had always been attentive, organized, the kind of person who remembered doctor's appointments and sent birthday cards on time. Her husband worked in finance. They had 2 young children who called me Grandpa and climbed on my lap and made the holidays feel less hollow. I trusted them completely. That is the sentence I have to sit with now. I trusted them completely. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday in February. I had driven into town to pick up a prescription, and when I came back, I noticed that the filing cabinet in my study, the one I keep locked, was sitting at a slightly different angle than I had left it. It was pushed about 2 inches away from the wall on the left side. Small thing, the kind of thing most people would chalk up to their own forgetfulness. I am not most people. 32 years of medicine trains you to notice discrepancies. A number slightly outside the normal range, a symptom that doesn't quite fit the expected pattern. You learn to pay attention to the things that are almost right, because almost right is where the danger lives. The cabinet had not moved on its own, and the only other person with a key to my house was my daughter. I didn't say anything. I went back to my study, sat down, and thought carefully. The cabinet contained my financial records, investment accounts, the deed to the house, Margaret's life insurance documents, my own will. I had updated that will 14 months earlier, after a long conversation with my attorney. My daughter was the primary beneficiary. Her husband was not mentioned by name, but as her spouse, the arrangements were straightforward. I pulled out the folder with my will and checked the last page. It looked untouched, but something still sat wrong in my chest. The way a patient's lab results can look normal on paper while the patient in front of you clearly is not well. I started paying closer attention after that. Over the next 6 weeks, I noticed other things. A conversation I'd had with my daughter about my memory issues, a topic she had introduced, not me, after I forgot what day a lunch was scheduled. I don't have memory issues. I forgot one lunch, but she brought it up again the following week, and then again when we were at dinner with her husband, and I watched him nod slowly, with a particular kind of practiced concern on his face that I recognized from pharmaceutical sales representatives who used to come into my office. The nod that says, "I've rehearsed this moment." I noticed that she had started taking photographs during her visits, not of the grandchildren playing in the yard, of the rooms, of the bookshelves, the kitchen, the garage. I saw her holding her phone up in the direction of my desk once, and when I looked at her, she smiled and said she was texting a photo of my old medical diploma to her friend whose son was applying to that same university. I said nothing. I filed it away. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon in early April. I was in the garden, and my daughter and her husband were sitting on the back porch with coffee. They didn't know I could hear them. The window above the kitchen sink was open, and voices carry in still air when you've spent enough quiet years learning the acoustics of your own property. My son-in-law said something about a timeline. My daughter said they needed to move before summer because the market was better right now. My son-in-law said the attorney had confirmed the documentation would hold. My daughter was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My name, my first name, the way she hasn't called me since she was a teenager, and said, 'He won't fight it. He doesn't have anyone else.'" I set down my trowel very carefully. I did not turn around. I stood there in Margaret's garden with the smell of roses around me, and I let those words move through me like a cold front. "He won't fight it. He doesn't have anyone else." I went inside through the side gate. I told them I was feeling tired, and they left without anything seeming unusual. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door the way he always did, firm and slightly too long, and I looked him in the eye and smiled. That night I sat in my study for 3 hours, and I thought about what a retired physician with no legal training but 32 years of methodical documentation and a lifelong intolerance for being lied to could actually do. I came up with a plan. I called my attorney the next morning from my cell phone while parked 2 blocks from his office, not from my landline at home. I had already begun wondering whether that line was compromised in some way, whether someone had access to records of my calls. I didn't know. But I had learned in medicine that when you don't know the extent of a problem, you contain it first and investigate second. My attorney, a man I've known for 20 years, listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The fact that you're sitting here, presenting this in chronological order with specific observations and dates, is itself significant." He told me that what I was describing was a pattern consistent with undue influence proceedings, an attempt to have me declared legally incapacitated so that control of my assets could transfer to a designated party. He said it happened more than most people realized, particularly with older adults who lived alone and whose family had access to their personal and financial documents. He told me the most important thing I could do was to create an evidentiary record. Document everything. Dates, times, exact words when possible. And he told me about a forensic accountant he worked with who could review my financial accounts for any unauthorized activity. We met with the forensic accountant 4 days later. It took her less than 2 weeks to find it. Over a period of 8 months, small transfers had been made from one of my investment accounts, not my primary account, but a secondary one I rarely logged into, set up years ago as a kind of overflow for a portion of my practice sale proceeds. The transfers were small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Between $700 and $1,200 at a time moved to an account registered to a holding company. The holding company, when my attorney traced it, had a registered agent address in a state neither my daughter nor her husband had any apparent connection to, but it had been incorporated about 3 weeks after my wife died. 3 weeks after Margaret died. I remember the exact moment my attorney showed me that date. I was sitting across from his desk on a Tuesday afternoon with rain against the windows, and I looked at that date and thought about how my daughter had spent those 3 weeks. She had been at our house almost every day. She helped plan the funeral. She sat beside me at the service and held my hand. She sorted through her mother's clothes because she said she didn't want me to have to do it alone. She was at our house almost every day. I asked my attorney what I should do next. He told me that what I had was compelling but not yet sufficient for a full proceeding. We needed to understand the scope of the plan specifically, whether there was an attempt to formally challenge my mental competency, which would likely involve attorneys and possibly a physician they had recruited to provide an evaluation. He suggested I do something that would either accelerate their timeline or expose it. He suggested I go away. The original idea was a fishing trip, something I'd mentioned to my daughter in passing months earlier as something I wanted to do that summer. A week up at a lake house, owned by my old medical school roommate, who had since retired to Vermont. My attorney said, "Tell her you're going. Book the flights so there's a record. Then don't go." It felt elaborate. It felt like something from a movie. I told him that, and he looked at me for a long moment and said that unfortunately the situation required it. I booked the flights. I told my daughter I would be gone for 9 days, starting the following Friday. I mentioned it casually, said I thought it would be good for me to get away, that I'd been feeling cooped up. She said that sounded wonderful, and that she was glad I was getting out of the house. There was a warmth in her voice that I might have found reassuring once. Now I heard something underneath it, a kind of relief, and I had to work to keep my expression neutral. I drove to the airport on Friday morning. I checked in for the flight. I sat at the gate for 40 minutes, and then I went to the men's room, waited, and walked out a different exit. My car was parked at a lot 8 minutes from the airport. I drove to a motel on the west side of the city, paid in cash, and checked in under a name the desk clerk didn't question because she wasn't paying close enough attention, and I had a confident enough manner from decades of walking into exam rooms. My neighbor called me that same evening. I should tell you about my neighbor. He is 74 years old, a retired high school principal, a man who has lived in the house to the right of mine since before my children were born. He lost his wife 6 years before I lost Margaret, and we had the kind of friendship that forms between two men who have survived the same particular grief. Quiet, unspoken, maintained largely through front porch coffee and the occasional borrowed tool. He was not a man who alarmed easily, and he was not a man who called me without reason. He said, "Your daughter's car is in the driveway, and there's another car there too." He didn't recognize it. A man in a suit had gone inside about 20 minutes ago. I asked him to describe the car. He did. I asked if he could see anything through the front window. He said the blinds had been drawn. I thanked him and told him I would explain later. He didn't ask questions. 74 years of working with adolescents teaches you when to wait. I had already, with my attorney's guidance, installed 3 small recording devices in my home the previous Wednesday. One in the study, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, all audio. All legal under Ohio's one-party consent statute, because I was the property owner and had consented to the recording on my own premises. My attorney had been very specific about this. He had also given me access to the recordings through a secure application on my phone. I opened the application. The audio quality was not perfect, but it was clear enough. My daughter's voice, her husband's voice, and a third voice, male, professional, measured that I did not immediately recognize. They were in my study. The third man was describing something in the kind of technical language that takes years to make sound casual. I had enough background in medical documentation to understand what he was outlining. He was explaining the process for filing a petition in probate court to establish a guardianship. The grounds he was describing were cognitive decline and an inability to manage financial affairs. He was explaining what medical documentation would be needed to support the petition. He mentioned a physician, a name I didn't recognize, who had agreed to provide an evaluation. My daughter asked when it could move forward. The man said the preferred window was while I was out of town, because it would allow them to secure certain documentation from the property before I returned. He said the evaluation could be conducted in absentia initially, based on records, which was unusual but achievable under specific circumstances that he had already addressed. My son-in-law asked about the house specifically. The man explained the process by which, once guardianship was established, an appointed guardian could petition for authority over real property. There was a pause. Then my daughter said, "He's going to be so angry." Her husband said, "It doesn't matter if he's angry. That's actually helpful for our case." I sat in that motel room with my phone in my hand and listened to my daughter, the person who held my hand at her mother's funeral, who brought me soup when I had pneumonia the winter before last, who named her first child after my father, discuss how my anger would be useful evidence of my instability. I did not break down. I want to be clear about that. I sat very still for a long time, the way I used to sit before a difficult conversation with a patient's family, and I let it settle in me. Not the anger, the clarity. There is a difference, and the difference matters. I called my attorney. He said, "Stay where you are. Do not contact your daughter. Do not return to the house. Let them finish what they came to do, and let the recording capture it." I stayed in that motel for 3 days. My neighbor called me twice daily with updates. The attorney met with me in person on the second day with a colleague who specialized in elder law and probate litigation. The forensic accountant provided an updated report showing 3 additional transfers that had been initiated the same week I allegedly left for my trip, as though whoever was managing that account had decided the window was open. On the morning of the 4th day, my attorney filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Bar Association regarding the attorney my daughter had retained, specifically citing the recorded conversation as evidence of facilitation of fraud. He also filed an emergency motion in probate court to have the fraudulent evaluation petition dismissed and to establish a protective order over my assets. And he contacted the county sheriff's office to report the unauthorized removal of documents from my property, which my neighbor had photographed through the front window on the second evening, images of my son-in-law carrying a banker's box to his car. I came home on a Thursday morning, 2 days before my daughter expected me back. She was not there. I walked through my house room by room. The filing cabinet had been opened. The lock was visibly damaged. Several folders were missing from the section containing my financial records. My desk had been searched, though someone had made an attempt to leave it tidy. They had not moved the framed photograph of Margaret on the corner of the desk. And somehow, that was the detail that made my hands shake for the first time since this had all begun. I sat down in my study chair and looked at her face in that photograph for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called my daughter. She answered on the second ring with the warm, slightly worried voice she had been using with me for months, the voice calibrated for a man whose mind was going soft. I told her I was home early. I told her I had decided the trip wasn't for me after all. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know about what was happening on her end of it. She said that was fine. That was great, actually. She would come by later that week. I said, "Come by tomorrow. There are some things I'd like to talk about as a family." She said, "Of course," and I could hear her husband's voice in the background asking what was wrong, and I listened to the way she said nothing. Nothing's wrong. And I thought about the 41 years of roses still growing along my fence line, and I said goodnight and hung up. They arrived the next evening, both of them, my son-in-law carrying a bottle of wine, the way he always did when he wanted the atmosphere to be light. My daughter hugged me at the door. I held her for a moment longer than usual and felt her stiffen slightly in a way she tried to cover by squeezing my shoulder. We sat in the living room. My attorney was in the kitchen, out of sight but present. This had been his recommendation, and I had agreed to it. I asked them how things were going. My son-in-law talked about work for a few minutes. My daughter asked about Portland. I told her the lake had been beautiful. She said she was glad I'd been able to get away. Then I slid a folder across the coffee table. My son-in-law looked at it before my daughter did. The change in his face happened in layers. First, confusion, then recognition, then something that he attempted to rearrange into neutral in the space of about 2 seconds. He was not fast enough. My daughter opened the folder. It contained a summary memo from my attorney, 2 pages, outlining the documentation we had gathered, the financial transfers, the recorded conversation, the photographs my neighbor had taken, the probate court filing that now bore her name and her husband's as petitioners, the name of the physician they had engaged, and the name of the attorney who had been in my study. She looked at those pages for a long time without speaking. Her husband started to say something about misunderstandings, about context, about how there were aspects of this she needed to understand regarding concerns they had about my well-being. His voice had the practiced quality of someone who had rehearsed a contingency. I let him get through about 30 seconds of it. Then I told him that anything he wanted to say to me from this point forward would need to be said to my attorney directly, and that anything said in this room tonight was being recorded with full legal disclosure, and that my attorney was in the next room and available to speak with them now if they preferred. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have heard in a very long time. My daughter was crying by then. Not the strategic, soft crying I had half expected, the kind of thing deployed to redirect a conversation. This was something rawer, less controlled, and for a moment I felt something tear in my chest, because she is still my daughter, and I had watched her come into the world, and I had watched her mother love her with everything she had. But I also thought of that conversation on the porch. He won't fight it. He doesn't have anyone else. She had been wrong about both things. The legal proceedings took 8 months. The probate petition her attorney had filed was dismissed within the first 3 weeks, once our evidentiary record was submitted. The bar complaint against her attorney resulted in a formal sanction and a suspension of his license. The financial fraud case took longer. My son-in-law had been the primary architect of the account transfers. With my daughter's knowledge, the recordings made that distinction difficult to dispute, though her attorney tried. In the end, my son-in-law pleaded guilty to elder financial exploitation, a felony under Ohio law, and received a suspended sentence with 5 years probation, restitution of the full amount transferred, and a permanent bar from holding any financial power of attorney in the state. My daughter was not charged criminally, a decision that my attorney explained was partly prosecutorial discretion and partly a function of her demonstrably secondary role. I did not fight that outcome. I want to be honest about why. It was not mercy. Exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was the knowledge that the criminal system would give her a record and a courtroom and a news cycle, and that none of those things would give me back the person I thought she was. That person, I was already beginning to understand, had perhaps not existed in the form I imagined her. Or perhaps she had, once, and something had shifted over years I hadn't paid close enough attention to. I updated my will. I established an irrevocable trust for the benefit of my grandchildren, administered by an independent trustee, not my daughter, not her husband, not anyone whose interests were entangled with the value of what I owned. My attorney helped me structure it so that the children would have access to funds for education and medical care, regardless of what happened between me and their parents. They are 6 and 8 years old. They didn't choose any of this. My daughter and I have not spoken in the months since the proceedings concluded. I leave that door open by not closing it. There is a difference between those two things, and I think about it often. My neighbor came over for coffee the Saturday after the sentencing. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the way he has sat across from me 100 times, with his hands wrapped around his mug and the morning light coming through the window, and he asked me how I was doing with the kind of directness that only very old friends can manage. I told him the truth. I told him that I was doing better than I expected, and worse in the ways I hadn't anticipated, and that I was still working out which parts of the last 3 years were things I should have seen sooner, and which parts simply could not have been seen at all. He nodded. He said that, in his experience, those two categories were harder to tell apart than most people admitted. We sat with that for a while. I still water Margaret's roses every morning. They came back thicker this spring than I've ever seen them, which my neighbor says is because I've been giving them slightly more water than they need, which he says Margaret would have already told me if I had asked her. He is probably right. I overcorrect when I'm anxious. It is not the worst of my tendencies. The morning after the sentencing, I stood out at the fence line with my watering can, and I thought about what my wife would have made of all of it. Margaret was not a woman who softened things she believed in. She would have been devastated. She also would not have wanted me to be devastated for longer than was necessary. She would have told me to document everything and then let the documents do their job and then make coffee. I did all three, in that order. I think about what it means to protect something, a home, a life, a version of yourself that you've spent decades building. People assume that protection is loud, that it announces itself, that a man who is being stolen from should be visibly falling apart, should be confused and frightened and easy to manage. I understand now why those assumptions are so useful to the people who hold them. I was never confused. I was never easy to manage. I spent 32 years looking at the full picture of what was in front of me and making decisions based on evidence rather than what I wished were true. That discipline did not leave me when I left medicine. It did not leave me when Margaret left me, and it did not leave me when my own daughter sat in my study with a man in a suit and discussed the timeline for taking everything I had built. What I have learned, and I offer this not as a lesson but simply as what I know now, is that the people most likely to underestimate you are the people who love you least carefully. They see what they expect to see. They believe you are what your grief has made you look like. They count on the fact that you won't want to believe the worst of them, because you raised them, or you chose them, or you opened your home to them. They are not entirely wrong about that last part. I didn't want to believe it. For a long time, some part of me was constructing alternate explanations, misunderstandings, financial stress, a bad attorney leading them somewhere they hadn't fully understood. I held on to those explanations even when the evidence made them harder and harder to maintain. But there is a point at which holding on to an explanation becomes its own kind of betrayal of yourself, of what you know, of the discipline that kept you reliable through 3 decades and 100,000 difficult moments. I reached that point on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in my attorney's office, looking at an incorporation date 3 weeks after I buried my wife. After that, I stopped constructing alternate explanations. and I started building a case. My grandchildren came to visit last Sunday. Their mother dropped them off at the end of the driveway. She didn't come to the door, and I didn't expect her to. My granddaughter ran straight to the roses and asked me if she could pick one, and I said yes, just one, and she chose the most open one she could find and carried it inside and put it in a glass of water on the kitchen table, the way her grandmother used to do. My grandson asked me if we could play chess. He is 8 years old, and he takes the game seriously in a way that makes me suspect he has been practicing against someone who hasn't told me. I let him think he was winning for the first 3 games. By the 4th game, I played honestly, and he studied the board for a long time before each move. And when I finally had him in check, he looked up at me and said, "You were letting me win before?" I said, "I was." He thought about that. Then he said, "That's not really fair to me, is it? Because now I don't know how good I actually am." I looked at him across the board, this 8-year-old boy with his father's jaw and his grandmother's eyes, and I said, "You're right. I'm sorry. From now on, I'll play my best every time, and you'll know exactly where you actually stand." He seemed satisfied with that. We reset the board. There are some things that cannot be softened without doing harm. Not every kindness that feels gentle in the moment is actually kind. The clearest thing I can offer someone I love, and I love those children more than I know how to say, is an honest accounting of where they are, of what is real, of what I actually see when I look at them. I failed to apply that principle to the people who were supposed to earn it most. I will not make that mistake again. The roses are blooming. I water them at the right amount now, not too much. The morning is quiet and cool the way Ohio mornings are in early summer, before the heat comes up off the pavement and the day gets loud. My neighbor waves from his porch when he sees me in the garden. I wave back. There are things I have lost that I will not recover. I know that. I am 68 years old, and I have buried a wife, and I have sat across from my own daughter in a legal proceeding, and I understand precisely what I am carrying and what it weighs. But I am here. I am clear-eyed. I am in my own house, which is mine, standing in my own garden, which is mine, and the people who believed that grief had made me manageable were wrong about something so fundamental that I almost feel sorry for them. Almost. The law does not ask whether something breaks your heart. It asks whether you can prove what happened. I proved what happened. And whatever else has been taken from me, nobody gets to take that. I go inside and make coffee. I sit in my chair in the study and I look at Margaret's photograph in the morning light, and I tell her that the roses look good this year. I tell her I think I'm finally getting the watering right. I think she would say, "It only took you 44 years. I think she would be smiling when she said it. I get up. There is a day ahead of me, and it belongs entirely to me, and that is enough.